Hello everyone! So if you've been following my channel for a little while, you might know that 4 years ago, more or less, I did an MA in linguistics. And in this video, I would like to talk about the dissertation I did for the MA. I'm hoping this video will be helpful for people that are considering studying linguistics at university, for example, or just for people that are interested in the topic of linguistics. For my dissertation, I always knew that it was going to be about bilingualism and code switching. And after a few weeks of researching and reading upon the topic of code switching and bilingualism, I came up with the following question, which I will read to you. It's, does Spanish-English bilinguals' perception of their own code switching correlate with their actual speech performance? I know the titles of linguistics papers are often quite pompous, but don't worry, I will go through the keywords now so you understand a bit better what my dissertation was about. So the first concept, and a very important one, is code switching. For the purpose of my dissertation, I took code switching as to mean the use of two languages in one sentence. Linguists in general don't tend to define code switching as simply as that, but for the purpose of my dissertation, it was enough and it worked. Then the second keyword is perception. By perception, what I meant is essentially how bilinguals would perceive the sentences as being acceptable or non-acceptable, or in other words, if they would find the sentences code mixed as being natural or unnatural, or if it's something they would maybe say or hear in normal conversations. In bilingual conversations, that is. And finally, performance is essentially a big word to say production of speech, so speaking, basically. Roughly speaking, the intent of my study was to see whether code switching was random or if there was some rules that are unwritten, but if there are some rules which would mean that certain types of switches are not really possible or are not actually used by bilinguals. On top of that, I was also interested in knowing whether bilinguals were aware of these rules or not. The type of code switches I was particularly interested in were switches such as she is de Madrid. So when you switch only the word de in the sentence, as opposed to saying from Madrid, for example, or also trying to find out whether bilinguals would also code switch the end of verbs. So, for example, whether bilinguals would be okay with a sentence such as estoy itiendo. Obviously, I had some intuition as to the kind of switches that would be accepted or unaccepted because I grew up bilingual myself and code switching is almost what I do for a living. So to test the theory of whether there is some constraints or limitations in terms of how people code switch, I used two methods. The first one was to create a survey with lots of sentences code switch at different places in the sentence. So sometimes it was a verb, other times it could be a preposition, just a noun, and many different types of code switches essentially. And then I would ask my participants to grade the sentences based on whether they would find them acceptable or unacceptable. For my survey, I was very lucky because I had in total 136 participants, which I didn't even think I would be able to reach. I thought I was going to get 50, but I got a lot of people participating in the study. And to find these people, I was lucky enough that a friend told me about a Facebook group in Gibraltar, and it was very useful because in Gibraltar people speak llanito, which is a language where people mix English and Spanish. It really was ideal for me because it meant that code switching was part of their communicative experience and it happened all the time. After the survey, what I did was to find a bank of transcripts of conversations of bilinguals in English and Spanish, and then to compare them to the questionnaire. So seeing if the type of code switches I found in the transcript sort of match the judgments of the bilinguals in the survey. And what do you think I found? Well, let's find out. Overall, and I'm going to read my notes, the trend was that most switches that were deemed acceptable contain question tags. So question tags are essentially things like, you okay, right? It's not here, is it? Or that kind of thing, you know, what you add at the end to check understanding of something with someone. And as predicted, nouns, verbs, adjectives and adverbs were deemed to be acceptable most of the time. It wasn't always clear-cut though, because sometimes with some of the code switches that I put in the questionnaire or the survey, sometimes bilinguals wouldn't agree 100% on whether they would find them acceptable or unacceptable. So I thought it was important to interpret the results as trends as opposed to something that is factual. On the other hand, the switches that tended to be seen as unacceptable were usually grammatical words such as prepositions, pronouns or articles. What I thought was very interesting when I saw the results was that some sentences that I thought would be accepted, such as "my father es un profesor," were actually sort of in the middle, so bilinguals didn't really agree 100% on whether they would accept it or not accept it at all. And it's kind of hard for me to say why, because my study didn't allow me to draw any conclusions, but my assumption, maybe, is that these words are too basic for them to switch, and maybe they would just stick to one language when saying that thing in particular. If you have any other ideas as to why this sentence hasn't been accepted, please share them in the comment section. That can be interesting to see what you think. To conclude this video, I thought my study was very interesting, not just because I did it, but because the results were actually very interesting. They did show that bilinguals, to some extent, they had an understanding of what kind of things were sort of switchable and non-switchable, if I may say. And when I looked at the transcripts which I analyzed, it seemed to match the judgments that I had on the questionnaire. So the switches that actually happened in conversation were seen as being acceptable, and the others that didn't appear in actual conversation on the data I had were not seen as acceptable. And the last thing that I thought was very interesting was that even though there isn't a formal grammar of code switching like you would have in French or Spanish, you have like formal grammar books, still bilinguals seem to be aware of some kind of unwritten rule of code switching. So that's it for today. I hope you found the video interesting. If you have any questions, because I didn't go into a lot of detail in this video, please feel free to ask me in the comment section. I always make sure I reply to comments, and I will see you later. Bye!